let's see if there are still some questions that you would like to ask.
So I have a question around the triple gems.
Yes.
I was just thinking, what's a better way to understand and relate it to those, we taking the refuge of the three. So especially I think the Buddha part of it, I think I don't fully understand because I know, I'm not sure if it's more than the Buddha Gautama or is this, what does it mean, the true meaning of those? I think each one of them, I will have a little bit question about what they actually are and how to better relate it to taking refuge of the three.
Okay. Yes, well, the triple gem is taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And taking refuge in the Buddha really means the Buddha himself. It means that you know and you trust and you understand that he discovered the Dhamma basically entirely on his own without any teacher. And without a Buddha in the world, we would have no clue as to how to make an end of suffering. So taking refuge in the Buddha is really that you really trust that he showed the way how to practice, and you are grateful for that. Taking refuge in the Dhamma is, well, it's basically that you also have a trust and a confidence that these laws that the Buddha discovered are really working like he explained. So on the micro level, for instance, how dependent origination works, or the Four Noble Truths, and all the other things that are explained in the suttas. And then the final one of taking refuge in the Sangha is that you have a trust that there are beings in this world and that have attained all these stages of Nibbana, either stream entry or the second one, or anagami or arahants. And it's really something that is quite beautiful, because the triple gem is not only used for taking refuge in them, which basically means that you consider yourself really a follower of these teachings and of what the Buddha was teaching, and that you are planning to go through with it. But separately, they are also very often used to uplift the mind, that people, for instance, start the meditation with reflecting on the good qualities of the Buddha or the Dhamma or the Sangha, and it can give rise to a lot of happiness. So some people even use it instead of, spiritual friend. They might decide to bring up metta by reflecting first on one of these gems, so to speak, and it can make for an incredible amount of gratefulness and happiness. One of the other reflections that is also often used is the reflection of generosity, reflecting on your own acts of generosity, or reflecting on your acts of virtue, that you are keeping the precepts and things like that. And another one would be the reflecting on the devas and the deva realm, which can also be a quite joyous reflection, so to speak. Would that answer your question?
I think in general, is this taking refuge meaning seeking protection?
not sure. Maybe Delson could answer it. I use it in a way of having confidence in these three, and it's like a decision that you are following this path, and it makes you happy, and you trust in these values. But maybe Delson could add something to that.
Yeah, I would tend to say the same thing, that it's a sense of uplifting the mind whenever you take refuge in the triple gem. You know, yesterday we had a junior monk go on a trip. He had to leave, so all I told him was, you know, just don't forget to keep your precepts, which obviously he knows, and continue to take refuge in the triple gem, and that will protect you. So I see it as that as well, in the sense that when you have an uplifted mind, when you have a mind that is reverential because of your confidence in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, then your choices also help protect you from any kind of dangers. So it translates in an uplifted mind, and an uplifted mind translates to a mind that is obviously more heedful, more careful, more mindful, and gets out of the way of anything that could be considered a dangerous situation. But I just came in and I was listening to about, I guess, half of Sil's answer. I'm not sure how long you had been talking for, but I think, you know, that was a wonderful answer to what you were talking about. And I would say the same.
Okay, thank you.
And can I ask, so the purpose of repeating it 3 times, it's kind of like, it seems like, I know in the suttas when someone was asking the Buddha something, they'd repeat it 3 times in order to get an answer. So is the purpose of repeating the refuges, there seems to be some magic around 3 or something. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, Bob, haven't you heard 3 is a magic number? You can do so many things with the number 3. But there is something to be said about doing it 3 times, because it's, well, I mean, this is just adding my own meaning to it. I don't think you'll see it in the suttas, but the way I understand it is you're resolving in your mental, your verbal, and your physical being, so to speak, taking refuge in these things. But that's just my interpretation of it. It's not necessarily in the suttas, but I think just saying it 3 times, it really sinks in, you know, in the mind.
Oh, for me, saying things 3 times, I think I'm actually starting to pay attention about the 3rd time. So it's okay.
Good.
Anyway.
Yeah, I think it's more of a habit than that it actually says so to do so in the suttas. That's, I guess in the past, people thought, well, if you really want an answer that the Buddha, for whatever reason, chooses not to give, you ask 3 times, then maybe it's also worthwhile to repeat these refuges 3 times. But it is not something that you will find in the suttas that you should do it that way.
Yeah.
But I like Delson's
Yeah,
explanation about seeing it in the sense of the 3 formations. That's nice.
Yeah. And I also say, historically speaking, I believe in the Vinaya, it probably says this, that in the beginning, it was only taking refuge in the Buddha and the Dhamma. It was, I think, only after the Buddha passed on to Parinibbana that then there was taking refuge in the Sangha as the 3rd. And if you see in the suttas, I believe a lot of times the lay people that go on and take refuge, they say, I take refuge in the Buddha, or I take refuge in the teachings of the Buddha. So it's not as concrete as you will find in the suttas, but it is still a nice tradition to be able to do that. It just is a good reminder in the morning or in the start of your day, whenever that might be, to, number 1, take the precepts, and number 2, take refuge in the triple gem. We seem to be missing 2 people, Sil. Are we?
3 people actually. One couldn't make it, but the other 2 haven't shown up. I have pinged them, but no answer as of yet. So
Okay.
it's a small group.
Yeah.
So I hope these 2 are loaded with questions.
Ask now or forever hold your peace, lest you regret it.
I have a question. It's not really about the practice more. It's about related to one of the talks that you gave recently, Delson. And it was about the talk you gave about the 31 planes. And I really enjoyed that talk a lot. But my question is, the practice as presented by the Buddha is, he always says, see for yourself and don't take it on faith. Come and practice. And but then when you talk about the 31 planes, it kind of sounds like science fiction fantasy some of the time, and it seems like it takes a leap in faith to get to some of these concepts. And I was just wondering, you seem very knowledgeable about the planes, and I guess I'm wondering, how did you become so knowledgeable, number one? And then number two, is this something that you can access or see better as you get, attainments and that sort of thing?
So I'll answer the second question. And in answering the second question, you'll understand that it's also an answer to the first question. There's a way of doing these things by using what's known as the threefold knowledge. So you go through a process of going through past lives. You go through a process of looking at, the different realms of existence, not for fun, but because of you want to understand karma. And it's a natural process. You go into the fourth jhana and you incline your mind towards certain memories. So it's like your mind is on rewind and it's looking at certain events. And not every event is going to be interesting. Not every event is going to be some kind of a lesson in it. It's just rooted in that memory or in those formations. But then you start to see certain trends. You start to see certain kinds of things regarding, why you made this choice or how this choice came about, rather. How did this choice lead to the next consequence, which then created an opportunity for another kind of choice. And then eventually what you're starting to see is dependent origination. And you're starting to see how the links of dependent origination run throughout many, 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 many lifetimes. And then you make a leap into inclining the mind towards the arising and passing away of other beings. When you do that, you start to see how these beings arose in a certain kind of existence, whether it's a lower existence or an existence like in the Brahma realms. And you start to see what is it that caused them to take birth in that existence, or what is it that caused them to take birth in a new existence, depending upon their karma. So there is a methodology to it. I know Bhante rarely ever teaches it, if he does, and it's something that is rarely ever talked about. But the 31 planes of existence, one, you have to understand, you don't have to believe in them. You don't need to have a leap of faith in them. A lot of these stories or a lot of these ideas from the 31 realms of existence come from the cultural framework, let's say, of the Buddha's time. So it's inherited from the Brahmanical traditions, but that doesn't mean that it's Brahmanical in nature. It's just that these kinds of beings or these kinds of planes of existences are like archetypes. So for example, and you obviously probably heard this in that conversation, that you have Saka, who is also known as Indra in Hindu mythology, but he's also known amongst the Norse as Thor, or amongst the Greeks as Zeus. So these are posts, for example, in the realms of the 33 gods. These are kinds of posts that beings go through. So the Saka that is there currently will then become an Anagami, and there will be another being to replace his post. Just like there is a post for Mara, and a designated post for Mara, and so on and so forth. So You don't need it. You really don't need to see these realms, and you definitely don't want to do it out of curiosity, because that doesn't make sense. That's only going to proliferate a lot of ideas and concepts in the mind. But what it helps you understand and solidify is the experience of these different realms dependent upon different kinds of actions and consequences. And that might come about later. That kind of an understanding might come about later, and it might not. I mean, there are arahats that are mentioned in the suttas where they don't have any of the 6 higher powers, including the threefold knowledge, and they don't even have any of the 4 analytical knowledges and things like that. But they're arahats by virtue of the fact that they've destroyed the 3 taints. So it's not necessary for anyone to actually go through this process to attain full awakening. Having said that, it is useful to solidify one's understanding of karma. The other thing is there's also a psychological component to these different realms of existences. So while we understand them as being part of a spectrum of different kinds of planes of existence in reality, they're also understood psychologically. Like, for example, if you do an unwholesome act or have an unwholesome intention and produce an unwholesome act, you may immediately experience in that point or in that very life the unwholesome consequences, which can feel like hell, or you have a greedy mindset or a jealous mindset, and you experience the psychological manifestation of a hungry ghost, somebody who's never satisfied, somebody who's always hungry, somebody who's always looking for the next big thing. So, or, when you go into the jhana realms, you're experiencing the mental experience of the Brahma beings, the first, second, third, fourth jhana, and then the arupa jhanas and so on. When you keep your virtues, when you keep your precepts and you're being generous and wholesome, there's an immediately uplifted state. And that state of mind is very much similar to that of the devas in the deva realms. So there's an understanding on the physical or the reality level, which is not necessary, but there's also a psychological component to it.
And I have one more question about the arahant. So the arahant, there's no more rebirth, there's no more becoming. So an arahant is not reborn in a higher realm. An arahant is, they're done, right?
They're done. Yeah, they're done.
Okay.
Reason is because there's no more craving left in their mind. There's no craving, there's no conceit, there's no ignorance. And so, the reason why there is rebirth is because people have some kind of, or beings have some kind of a response to what they see as being their final thoughts before the dissolution of the body. And that causes the mind to cling to something, which causes the renewal of being through a process of creating a new rebirth linking consciousness. When that happens, then there is that consciousness that descends into a new nama rupa, into a new mentality, materiality, or a new nama or a new mentality in, let's say, the arupa realms. When that happens, then there's the arising and passing away of further consciousnesses in that existence. Once that rebirth linking consciousness dissipates, there's a story which is, I think, the Vakali Sutta, in which the Buddha points out to the Vulture's Peak, a cliff, where an arhat passes on, and there's this black smoke around his body. And the Buddha says, "You see that, monks? That is Mara looking for the consciousness of Vakali, but he can't find it because Vakali became an arhat. And so in becoming an arhat, there is no more formations that can give rise to a new rebirth linking consciousness. So the arhat the arhat becomes, for lack of a better word, a non-being. There's no more being there. And the definition of being is one that clings and identifies with any of the 5 aggregates in one way or another. So that's completely gone. And so one of the metaphors that's used for the 5 aggregates is like sandcastles. And I think you were there. I don't know if you were there when Monte was talking about that metaphor of the sandcastles, where the arhat, when they die, it's like the water comes on and dissolves the sandcastle, and there's nothing left there. So the fuel of the aggregates just dissipates. It's burnt out, and there's no further fuel for being.
And do you have to do, like when you were talking about the exercise of going to the fourth jhana and putting the mind on rewind, is that something that's required to develop a thorough understanding of karma, or does your understanding of karma develop as you get the attainments, basically?
Yeah, your understanding of karma gets much more refined as you start to see more the links to dependent origination in every moment. And that can happen with the sharpening of mindfulness and with every attainment, as you said. I see the the knowledge of rebirth and the knowledge of the 31 realms as the cherry on top or the icing on the cake. It's not really necessary. It's just an extra bonus, you know.
Also, my question is about in the sutta that there are phrases to be 5 aggregated subject to cleaning. So is that a cleaning meaning the cleaning to the self-identity?
Yes. Basically, what it's saying is the clinging that's there present is identifying with any of the 5 aggregates. So we talk about identity view in the sense of there's generally 20 different kinds of identity view that are mentioned in different suttas and in different contexts. But generally what it is it's the 5 aggregates multiplied by the 4 viewpoints. And the first viewpoint is that there's a self that is basically the 5 aggregates, meaning any of the 5 aggregates is equal to self. The second view is that the self is within the 5 aggregates. The third view is that the self is, or the aggregates are within the self. And then the fourth one is that the self is separate to the 5 aggregates, any of the 5 aggregates. So the clinging that we talk about is really the clinging, the 5 aggregates affected by clinging is that sense of the mind identifying with any of those 5 aggregates as self in any of these different ways.
The last one, I think the last one over the fourth, I think is a little bit hard to understand. Isn't that same as non-self, or what does that identity is like? Not identifying with self.
What it's saying is there's a separate self. So there's the 5 aggregates and there's a self that is separate to those 5 aggregates. It's like a consciousness, or it's a soul that owns the 5 aggregates or controls the 5 aggregates. So for example, the body is seen as being a owner, or a controlled by rather, a self, or the feelings and perceptions, formations, or consciousness are seen as possessed by a separate self. And that separate self is some kind of entity outside of the scope of the 5 aggregates.
Okay, thank you. I'm a little bit confused about the relationship between understand like right view versus to right thought, which is right choices, or sorry, effective choices. So consciousness formation, they all keep rising, they're impersonal, they just rise as is. Then how, what's that process that we're making the right choice in terms of want to continue to practice, want to continue to keep the precept? What's that process? I mean, how do we make choice?
Yeah. So when we talk about right view, we know that there's the mundane and super mundane. So the super mundane is really the 4 noble truths, being able to be mindful of the 4 noble truths in every given moment. The super mundane right view is more to do with understanding a little bit of action and consequence, understanding that there is meaning in being generous and keeping the precepts. There's meaning in being grateful for one's parents because they gave the opportunity of life here where one can attain potentially full awakening and so on. Right intention, or effective choice, as you said, from the booklet, is basically threefold. There are 3 components to that. Number 1, it's renunciation, which is translated from nekama, Number 2 is non-ill will. And number 3 is non-cruelty. So when we talk about renunciation, what we're talking about is a mind that doesn't take things personal, a mind that sees everything as being impersonal, a mind that sees everything as being not mine, not me, not myself, and therefore renounces, mentally speaking, any kind of attachment to any of the experience of the six sense bases. When we talk about non-ill will, that's really talking about loving kindness, because loving kindness is the antidote to ill will. And then, of course, when we talk about non-cruelty, that's really about compassion, and that being the antidote to cruelty. So the effective choice will be rooted in an understanding of letting go and taking things in a way that doesn't add to suffering. And so that means seeing everything as an impersonal process, having loving kindness in one's thoughts, in one's words, and in one's deeds, and being compassionate and understanding that there are beings who are suffering. And so that gives you a better way of connecting, to empathize with other people. Because anything beyond that, or anything that is the opposite of that, is leading to further suffering. Because once you have the right intention or effective choice, that leads naturally into effective speech or effective communication, because that leads you to also effective behavior or right action, because it's always your intentions that lead into whatever might be in the way of thoughts, words, or deeds. So if your effective choice is rooted in being loving and kind, in being compassionate, and seeing everything as being impersonal, then your speech will reflect that and won't cause further harm, and rather even come to a point where it starts to douse any fiery situations or conflicts. And because your intention is rooted in that right intention, your actions as well will be rooted in what is basically taking the 5 precepts. You don't kill or harm beings with intention. You don't use false speech. You don't take what is not given. You don't have sexual misconduct. You don't have false speech. And of course, you don't indulge in intoxicants, because indulging in intoxicants then leads you to be heedless and break the other 4 precepts. So this is the way to understand it.
So where is intention sits in the 12 dependent nation, like original dependent nation link?
So intention is basically with regards to, intention is felt or understood at nama rupa, because at nama, which is mentality, we have the 5 components: contact, feeling, perception, intention, and attention. But you have to understand there is a interdependency or an interconnection between intention and formations. So we call them, sometimes they're known as volitional formations, sometimes they're known as karmic formations. But what's happening is when you make contact with something, that can give rise to an intention, and that intention arose because of formations. Now that intention can deviate in either to the wholesome or the unwholesome, dependent upon the quality of the formations. So that's why I would say that if you want to know how your formations are in terms of the quality, pay attention to your intentions. So it's like this: in terms of dependent origination, there's a contact, gives rise to a formation of mental, maybe a mental formation of giving rise to, of course, the feeling and perception of what is being seen, gives rise to possibly a verbal formation that you want to say something. Now that verbal formation activates a kind of consciousness that then gives rise to the awareness of what that intention is to speak. So that intention then gives rise to an action, an expression to speak, or if it's physical formation, an expression to move in the mind, move in the body. So you have to understand that formations are what influence intention. But strictly speaking, intention is at the level of Namarupa, at mentality, materiality.
I think I may not fully understand this, but things about non-identity versus sense of self. I feel like you kind of answered maybe part of this question, but I'm still not fully understand. Say, we need a sense of self. So do we need a sense of self, or is it a sense of self that, again, that intention? I guess I don't know if I can equivalent a sense of self versus like together with the intention. To say, okay, I have this intention because of contact, and I want to continue to do good. I want to continue to practice, but that's not self identity. Like I don't identify it as self identity. Yeah. Can you explain, please?
That's a good question, because intentions can be seen as being me, mine, or myself. Like I made that choice, or I decided to make that choice. But what we have to see is those choices arose because of past causes and conditions. So there comes a point where the mind is able to perceive this as well, or understand it on this level, where you see that intentions as well, or choices that you make, arose because of previous choices that were made in a different time set. When those choices were made, they gave rise to certain kinds of consequences. Those consequences then became the causes and conditions for the next series of choices. And so the application or applying a sense of self to that is where then the suffering arises, because then you take that choice to be me, mine, or myself. And if that choice becomes to be something that's unwholesome, that gives rise to regret, remorse, restlessness, and anxiety. Or if it gives rise to something that is wholesome, then that choice being seen as me, mine, or myself gives rise to conceit, and gives rise to pride and arrogance, and so on. So if you just see choices as what they really are, which is that they arose dependent upon contact, and those choices, the quality of those choices arose dependent upon the formations, and those formations arose dependent upon previous choices, which continue to influence the next set of formations, then you start to let go of any understanding or application of a sense of self to this process. So for example, when you have the Eightfold Path, you're introduced to the Eightfold Path. You're introduced to the Dhamma, and being introduced to the Dhamma, that was not your choice, so to speak. It came about because of contact with somebody talking in a Dhamma talk, or somebody reading from the suttas. That then gave rise to an idea of following the Eightfold Path or following the Dhamma. But that choice in itself, where it seems like I was the one who went ahead and followed it, is not the case. It arose because a mind was uplifted and it decided to follow it. And so any choice that's made is dependent upon that contact, and that contact itself is impersonal.
Okay, thank you.
And to add that an arahant would have lost all sense of self and all conceit, but they would still be able to make choices and have intentions to act in certain ways. Those intentions would, by definition, be always free, wholesome, but we add that sense of self to reality. It isn't there, but we think it is. But all these things would happen even if you don't consider thinking in terms of me, mine, myself.
Yeah. And just as an aside, I'm joking here, but good luck with trying to give choices to an arahant. They'll just say, choose whatever you want. You try to give them choice of like red, blue, or green, and they'll just say, you choose, it's fine. What kind of food do you want to eat? Whatever is there. So the arahant is not even interested in any kind of choices. There will be preferences. There will be preferences in the body and tastes and things like that. But like Sil said, there won't be any identification with that by adding a sense of self to it. So arahants are not even bothered or interested in choice anymore. It just is all a flow. And any choices they do make in terms of any kind of, let's say, moral choices or choices in terms of speech, action, and words will always be rooted in the Eightfold Path. And that's why the Eightfold Path is also understood as being the cessation of karma. That's why the arahant doesn't produce new karma. Whereas when there's a choice that is personalized and taken to be self, it's liable to cause further karma if then there's craving in there, if there's conceit in there, if then there is ignorance in there. But with the case of the arahant, because all of their choices are rooted in the Eightfold Path, there won't be further karma. So you'll probably have come across in the booklet the understanding, or in the suttas, the understanding of karma and choice at a certain point. That'll be on day 7, where it's going to be talking about how there's something known as old karma and new karma. So old karma is everything from formations all the way down to feeling. Old karma is something to be experienced and felt and perceived. But new karma arises when there's a choice to take that thing as personal, so that's wrong intention, have craving towards it or aversion towards it, so again, that's wrong intention. And therefore from that craving, so that craving, the clinging, and the being gives rise to new karma, which is the birth of new action. And then that'll give rise to jara marana, or the rest of that whole series of suffering in that process of suffering. So what you should see is every time you have an experience, any experience you have, and you're met with a choice, see and reflect and observe where your mind tends towards. If there's craving in that choice, recognize it and let it go, and don't react to it. Once you react to it, what you are reacting to is the underlying tendency towards craving, aversion, or ignorance. And when you react to it, then that's liable to cause craving, aversion, or identification. But if there is a response rooted in wisdom, that is the action taken from right action, or speech taken from right speech, then it won't be liable to cause further arising of new karma. And what you're actually doing effectively is letting that old karma dissipate. This is why in the context of the meditation, every time you're met with a hindrance, understand that hindrance to be an old feeling. Understand that hindrance to be a old karma in the form of an unpleasant mental feeling in the meditation. When you see it, and don't react to it by pushing it or pulling it or doing anything with it, and just recognizing it right there and then using the rest of the 6R processes, or the 6R process, then that karma in the form of that hindrance dissipates. It might arise again, but it won't be as strong. It'll be weaker in its effect on the mind, and eventually it fades away. This is why the 6 R's are understood to be the encapsulation of the Eightfold Path, because it is right effort, which is the heart of the Eightfold Path. So every time you do the 6 R's, when you're met with an unpleasant feeling and there's craving arising, if you do the 6 R's, you're actually preventing new karma to arise from unwholesome choices and letting that old karma in the form of that unpleasant feeling to just dissipate.
I was going to make a comment and have a question also.
Yes.
It was funny when you mentioned the arahant and choices. I have a book. It's an old book by Ken Wilber where they were doing some research. Like in a laboratory, there were some scientists doing some research on an arahant apparently, and they were like using traditional methods like the ink blot tests and other things, and they couldn't get a read on anything because every time they tried to present something, the arahant would just try to help them in what they were doing. So it was like frustrating to the researchers because anyway, that was that. My question is, it's a practical question in terms of understanding. And what I was thinking about was like when you experience aggression from another person, and aggression from a stranger versus aggression from someone who's like close to you, like a loved one or a family member, and the intensity or the reverberation of that aggression, you know, obviously with the stranger, you know, if someone says something to me, it's easy to brush it off and not take it personally, versus if it's someone that is close to me, it's hard not to take it personally. And so consequently I suffer more. And so what I'm wondering is, you know, the practical solution to that problem.
Yeah. And that's a very common thing, because it is the closest ones that seem to cause the most harm when they speak in a negative manner or act in a certain way that is unwholesome. And the reason is because you're staying, you know, you have certain expectations of them. You've created an image of them, that this is my son, or this is my dad, and this is my mother. So dependent upon that image of them that you project, there's a certain level of expectation of how they should be as a mother, or how they should be as a father, or how they should be as a son, or how they should be as a sister or a brother, or whatever it might be, or as a friend. So there you have to see that, number one, how they react to you or how they respond is their own karma. And it's easier said than done. But if you start to see it that way, then you see that however they've acted is their choice, and the consequence of that is whatever it's going to be. But if you add to it by reacting in a way that is unwholesome as well, then what you're playing is a game of ping pong. You're passing the ball around of that negative karma from yourself to them. And so your choice there is to, you know, not play that game and let the ball go away, and, you know, don't get affected by it. So in the same way, you know, if a stranger came up to you and started shouting at you and abusing you and all of that, you think there was something wrong with them, and, you know, you wouldn't really think about it much. You just pass on by. But in reality, everybody has been in some way or another our mother or father or brother or whatever, but still we don't decide to act in the same way we would with our current parents or our current siblings or our current children. Because in that moment, we identify with them as being ours. We identify them as being part of our relationship. But if you really start to look at everything as being impersonal, then you see that even their choices are impersonal. And as I said, it's easier said than done, but it's a practice. It's a process of making the effort. You see in that moment, okay, this person, you know, whether it's my father or my son or my brother or whoever it might be, or my friend, is in a unwholesome mood. They're in a bad mood and they want to lash out with, you know, angry words or whatever it might be. But that's their choice. That's their karma. That's their responsibility. But I'm going to choose based on my understanding of seeing them as being in a framework in their mind of being in a state of suffering. I'm going to choose to be compassionate, empathize with them, and try to get them to calm down. So the more you can do this, what you'll see is actually your relationships will flourish, because then the other person will start to see that by me acting in an unwholesome way, but the other person acting in a wholesome way, I shouldn't be doing this over and over. And eventually they'll stop and start to reflect and make different choices.
Thank you.
I have also a question, if I may, since it's a small group. In the Telegram group, we had a discussion about keeping the precepts, and in some suttas, the Buddha not only goes as far as saying that you should really pay attention to keep the precepts in great detail, so to speak. But he also, I think it's a bit in the older suttas, like the Sutta Nipata and the Dhammapada, where he also tells people to restrain others from breaking precepts.
Yes.
Now, this sounds really beautiful, but I'm sure we all have had situations, for instance, with alcohol in the households. To give a personal example, I will never offer a guest alcohol. I will not buy alcohol, but I will tell them, well, if you want some, ask my husband or something, I don't even know where it is stashed, which technically speaking would be unwholesome. And it would also be unwholesome in a way to tell other people, no, don't drink. That is really not a good thing to do. Because in my opinion, that would be a really a situation where you could get in tremendous arguments and people getting angry. I mean, they would probably say something, well, it's fine that you are a Buddhist, but don't push your beliefs on my habits, for instance. So I was really wondering about, for instance, in the group, there was someone, she said to her husband who likes to drink socially, be wise with your drinking. But she didn't see herself going as far as to say, stop drinking. I mean, there is a point where it's really not a nice thing to state it in that way.
Yeah. I just have to say that's a little funny to me, like be wise in your drinking. It's almost like an oxymoron, you know, it's very ironic. How do you be wise in that? But I understand her situation, and I understand a lot of people's situations where, you know, you have a family member, or it's just a tradition in the household that people drink, and, you know, whatever it might be. In situations like that, you definitely don't want to offer a drink. And if people ask, you know, do you have alcohol? Just give them your point, that's saying that I'm a Buddhist, or I don't drink alcohol, and it would be great if you understand that I don't want to offer you alcohol either, because in that sense, it's also technically breaking a precept. Once you say that, then that's in their court. Then that's that person's choice. They can then ask somebody else, where's the alcohol, and that's their choice. There was actually a question like this in an interview with one of the students at one of the retreats at Dhamma, and I was there with Bhante, and this person asked, well, we own a restaurant, and you know, there's this, you know, they want to have a bar, and they want to have a liquor license, and this lady, she said, you know, I'm not the one who's offering them the alcohol, but then can I ask somebody else and say, hey, can you give them the alcohol? And Bhante said, no. Then you're causing somebody else to break a precept. Whether it's, you're not causing necessarily that person who's serving the alcohol to break the precept, technically speaking, but you're causing the customer to break a precept by offering them alcohol. So I think it's okay to be a little bit more assertive about these things. At the same time, if they choose to react negatively, understand that that's their choice. Then you stop right there and say, okay, well, just do whatever you want. I've already given you my understanding of this, and the choice is yours after that. Any last questions?
I was just going to make one comment and request based on that last answer, and that was that I really enjoy your talks about the precepts, and they're, I mean, I think you kind of extrapolated or interpreted the precepts in a broader means than I've heard in a lot of other talks, and so I'm just hopeful at some point you'll do that more, maybe by each individual precept, and do like, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for some modern interpretation. I mean, you do that a little bit in terms of talking about the internet and that sort of thing, but it's obviously the precepts as they addressed issues 500 years ago are different than the precepts and what we face every day with, you know, modern life. And so I'm just, anyway, that's my request. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I will at some point. Good. If there's no more questions, we'll share some merit.
May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shadow grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired with the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.